My name is Martha Sullivan. Most people call me Marty. I am 65 years old, a retired nurse, and I live alone in the house on Maple Street. The same house where my husband, Thomas, and I raised our 2 children for 31 years. Thomas passed away 4 years ago. After he died, the house became very quiet. I tried to be a strong mother. I tried to be the generous grandmother. But then came my 65th birthday. At 7 in the morning, my phone lit up with a text from my daughter-in-law, Jessica. It was not a happy birthday wish. It was not a phone call. It was just 11 cold words. We won't be coming today. Stephen thinks it is for the best. My son, the man I brought into this world 38 years ago, did not even send a text himself. I sat at my kitchen table, watching my coffee go cold. My good china was already set for 6 people. That was the moment I realized I had become invisible to the people I loved most. Before I tell you the heartbreaking truth about where my life savings actually went and the legal battle that followed, I would love to hear from you. Which city or state are you joining me from today? Please, leave a comment below. It helps me feel a little more connected to all of you. Note: while this story is a narrative created for reflection and inspiration, the message and the lessons it shares about family and boundaries are deeply important and hold value. Thomas and I lived in this house on Maple Street for 31 years. For 3 decades, this home was never quiet. It was a place of beautiful, messy noise. I can still close my eyes and hear the sounds of our life together. I hear the heavy thud of Thomas's work, boots by the back door, boots always caked with Maine mud. I hear the television in the den, turned up just a little too loud during the Red Sox games. I hear the laughter of our children, Stephen and Sarah, echoing down the hallway. Those were the years of full hearts and busy hands. I was a nurse. Thomas was a contractor. We worked hard, we saved what we could, and we built a life that felt solid. It felt unbreakable. But then, 4 years ago, everything changed in the span of a single afternoon. Pancreatic cancer. It is the cruelest word in the medical dictionary. The doctors told us it was advanced. They told us we had time, but they were wrong. From the day of the diagnosis to the day of the funeral, we only had 8 weeks. 8 weeks. In those final days, Thomas would sit in his favorite leather chair, his body growing smaller and more frail. He would reach out and squeeze my hand with what little strength he had left. He looked at me with those tired blue eyes and whispered, "Martha, you are going to be fine. You have always been the strong one." The strong one. He believed it. I think he had to believe it so he could leave this world in peace. But after the funeral, after the last casserole dish was returned, and the last sympathy card was tucked away in a drawer, the strength felt like a lie. The silence of the house became a physical weight. I would find myself standing in the kitchen for 20 minutes, staring at the stove, before I remembered that I did not need to cook dinner for 2 anymore. I would walk across the hardwood floors and the only sound I heard was the creak of my own footsteps. That was when the fear started. It was not exactly a fear of being alone. It was something deeper, something colder. It was the fear of becoming invisible. I was 61 years old when Thomas died. I realized that my children were busy. Stephen had his software career and his new wife, Jessica. Sarah had her own home. And her daughter, Emily. They had lives that were moving forward at 100 miles an hour. And then there was me. I was the widow on Maple Street. I was a memory. I started to worry that if I did not find a way to stay useful, if I did not have something to offer, they would slowly stop calling. They would slowly stop coming by. I did not want to be a burden. I wanted to be a part of their world. So, when Stephen called 6 months later, asking for $2,000, I did not hesitate. I felt a rush of relief. They needed me. I was still important. I was not invisible yet. I told myself that this was what Thomas would have wanted. He wanted me to take care of the family. He wanted us to stay close. I told myself that being the strong one meant being the one who provided. I did not realize then that I was not building a bridge to my children. I was building a pedestal for them to stand on, while I slowly sank into the background. They say that grief comes in waves, but for me, the financial requests from my children arrived like a slow, creeping tide. You do not notice the water rising at first. You just think your feet are a little damp. You do not realize you are about to drown until the shore is miles away. It began exactly 6 months after Thomas was buried. I remember the day perfectly. It was a Tuesday. A cold, grey Maine Tuesday. I was sitting at the kitchen table nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold when the phone rang. It was Stephen, my son. His voice sounded different. It was careful. It was rehearsed. He told me that he and Jessica were having some trouble with their cash flow. Nothing serious, he said. Just a little hiccup. Then he said the words that would change everything. Mom, we are a little behind on the mortgage this month. $2,000. That was the number. $2,000. To a software engineer and his wife. It should not have been a life-altering amount. But to a widow living on a fixed income, it was a mountain. Yet, I did not ask any questions. I did not ask how they got behind. I just felt a strange, desperate surge of purpose. I went to the bank that afternoon and I transferred the money. I told myself it was a one-time gift. I told myself I was being a good mother. I told myself that Thomas would have wanted me to protect our son's home. But a tide never stops at the first wave. 2 months later, it was Sarah. My sweet, emotional Sarah. She called me in tears. She told me that Michael had taken on extra tutoring shifts, but they were still coming up short. Little Emily needed new glasses. The insurance copay was outrageous. Everything is so expensive. Mom, she sobbed. I do not know how anyone survives these days. $1,500. I sent it. I sent it because I could not bear to hear my daughter cry. I sent it because Emily needed to see the world clearly. I sent it because it made me feel like the center of their universe again. The pattern that formed over the next 3 years was subtle. It was incremental. Stephen began calling every 4 to 6 weeks. It was always something new. Jessica's car needed new tires. They were behind on their property taxes. Jessica wanted to take a professional development course that cost several $1,000s. I never spoke to Jessica directly during those calls. I could hear her in the background, though. I could hear her whispering prompts to Stephen. A murmur here. A reminder there. Stephen's voice would remain neutral. Almost like he was reading a grocery list. Sarah was different. Her requests were always wrapped in a crisis. The furnace died. The roof leaked. Michael's car needed a new transmission. She made me feel like I was the only person in the world who understood her struggle. You are the only one who cares, Mom, she would say. I eventually set up automatic transfers. It felt more dignified that way. $1,500 to Stephen, $800 to Sarah, every single month. On the first of the month, like clockwork. But the monthly transfers were never enough. There were always the extras. Back to school shopping for Emily. Christmas gifts that had to be top of the line. And then there was the trip to Costa Rica. Stephen called me 2 weeks before their anniversary. He told me they were a little tight on cash, and he hated to ask. But could I help cover the flights? They just needed a break, he said. They were so stressed. I paid for the flights. To afford all of this, I did something I never thought I would do at my age. I went back to work. I signed up with a private home care agency. I spent my nights lifting elderly patients in and out of beds. I spent my weekends cleaning houses for people who were younger and wealthier than me. My back ached. My feet were swollen. But when I felt the exhaustion, I would look at the photos of my children on the mantel and tell myself a lie. I would say, Martha, you are being generous. You are keeping the family together. This is what a mother does. This is what Thomas wanted. I was not lonely, I told myself. I was not desperate for their phone calls. I was just being a provider. I was still the strong one. I did not want to see that I was being mined like a quarry. I did not want to see that my children only reached for my hand when it was holding a check. I kept working. I kept transferring. I kept quiet. I was drowning in that tide, and I was smiling while the water filled my lungs. The first time I really saw the truth was on Thanksgiving, 3 years after Thomas passed away. I wanted that day to be perfect. I wanted the house to feel the way it did when Thomas was alive, full of warmth and the smell of home. I spent 2 full days in the kitchen. I bought the biggest turkey I could find. I brined it overnight, using Thomas's secret recipe. I made his mother's New England clam chowder from scratch, a process that takes 5 hours of slow simmering. I made 2 kinds of homemade pie. I polished the silver until my fingers were sore. I ironed the lace tablecloth that had belonged to my grandmother. I wanted them to walk in and feel how much I loved them. Stephen and Jessica arrived 45 minutes late. Jessica did not even take off her coat. She walked right past me into the living room, her eyes glued to her phone screen. She was scrolling. She was typing. She was anywhere but in my home. Stephen gave me a half-hearted hug. The kind of hug you give a stranger at a funeral. Then he went straight to the kitchen. He did not ask if I needed help. He just lifted the lids on the pots to see what was for dinner. He looked at the food the way a person looks at a menu in a diner. Sarah and Michael arrived 20 minutes after that. Michael immediately sat on the sofa and turned on the football game. The volume was so loud I could barely hear myself think. Sarah set Emily down and disappeared into the bathroom for 20 minutes. Only little Emily ran to me. "Grammy Marty," she cried. She climbed into my lap and patted my cheeks. "You smell like pie," she said. "You always smell like pie." I held her tighter than I should have. I breathed in the scent of her hair and told myself that this was enough. I told myself that as long as Emily loved me, the rest did not matter. But dinner was a disaster. The food was lukewarm by the time everyone finally sat down. No one mentioned the clam chowder that I had spent all morning making. No one complimented the turkey. Jessica spent the entire meal holding her phone under the table. She thought I could not see it, but I saw the glow on her lap. She was texting. She was laughing at things I could not hear. Stephen and Michael talked about the game. They talked about work. They talked about things that did not include me. I sat at the head of the table, Thomas's chair, and I felt like a ghost. Sarah picked at her stuffing. "This is a little dry, Mom," she said. "Did you change the recipe?" I had used the same recipe for 30 years. The same recipe she used to beg for when she was a little girl. My heart sank, but I just forced a smile and offered her more gravy. At 5:30 in the evening, Stephen pushed back his chair. "We should probably head out," he said. I looked at the clock. They had been there for less than 2 hours. "But we haven't even had dessert yet," I said. "I made the pumpkin pie you like, Stephen, and the apple pie for Sarah. We told the neighbors we would stop by their cocktail party," Jessica said. Her tone was perfectly pleasant and completely final. She was already standing up, reaching for her designer handbag. They left 15 minutes later. Michael carried Emily to the car. The poor child was half asleep. Sarah paused at the front door. "Oh, Mom," she said. "The transfer was a couple of days late this month. I just wanted to make sure you didn't forget. Not. Thank you for the meal. Not. Are you okay spending the rest of the holiday alone? Not. I love you, Mom. Just. Did you forget the money?" I stood in the doorway and watched their taillights disappear down Maple Street. The air was cold, but the silence inside the house was colder. I went back into the kitchen. I looked at the piles of dirty dishes. I looked at the 2 pies sitting untouched on the counter. I looked at the silver that I had spent hours polishing. I did not start cleaning right away. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I put my back against the cabinets, and I cried. I cried for 40 minutes. I cried for Thomas. I cried for the woman I used to be. But the most terrible thing? I did not change anything. Even then, with the taste of that bitter dinner in my mouth, I told myself this was normal. I told myself that grown children have their own lives. I told myself that I was lucky they came at all. I was an ATM that smelled like pie. I knew it. And yet, I was too afraid of the silence to stop the machine. The house was cold on the night of my 65th birthday. The celebration that never happened had left a lingering bitterness in the air. I had spent the evening alone, washing the dishes I had set for a family that did not value my time or my presence. By 2 o'clock in the morning, sleep felt like a distant country I could not reach. I found myself walking toward the small room at the end of the hall. It was Thomas's office. I had kept it exactly as he left it. His reading glasses were still in the top drawer. His retirement paperwork was still organized in the second. I sat down in his old leather chair, and the scent of him, cedar and old paper, seemed to wrap around me. I opened my laptop. For years, I had avoided looking at the full picture of my finances. I had lived in a fog of one-time gifts and emergencies. But that night, the fog lifted. I logged into my bank portal and began to go back. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, all the way back to the month after Thomas died. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pen. I started to write down every transfer, every payment, every loan that was never repaid. $1,500 for Stephen's mortgage, $800 for Sarah's furnace, $2,000 for Jessica's tires and car repairs, $4,000 for the flights to Costa Rica, $1,500 for Emily's private tuition, which Sarah promised to pay back. My hand began to shake as the list grew longer. I saw the automatic transfers leaving my account every single month like a steady bleed. I saw the extra checks I had written during the holidays. I saw the money I had earned from my night shifts at the home care agency. Money I had worked for until my back screamed in pain, going directly into my children's bank accounts. I added up the numbers. I checked them twice. Then I checked them a third time. The total was $195,000. $195,000 in 4 years. I sat there in the dark, staring at that number. It was nearly my entire financial safety net. It was the life insurance Thomas had left me, to ensure I would never have to worry. It was my own savings from 40 years of nursing. And what did I have to show for it? I had an 11-word text from my daughter-in-law telling me that my son thought it was for the best to skip my birthday. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the Maine winter. I realized that I had been buying their love. I had been paying for the privilege of being their mother, and the more I gave, the less they respected me. The next morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, I called Abigail Henderson. Abigail had been our family attorney for 20 years. She was 70 years old, sharp as a needle, and she had known Thomas since before the children were born. When I walked into her office later that day, she did not offer me platitudes. She sat me down, poured me a cup of strong coffee, and looked at my yellow legal pad. She reviewed the bank statements. She looked at the screenshots of the texts asking for money. Her face remained still, but her eyes grew hard. "Marty," she said finally, "this is not generosity anymore. This is exploitation." She took off her glasses and leaned across the desk. She used a term I had never heard before. She called it elder financial abuse. I flinched at the word. Elder. I did not feel old. I felt used. Abigail explained that this pattern, the constant demands for money, combined with emotional withholding when I did not comply, was a form of manipulation. She told me that it did not matter that they were my children. It did not matter that I gave the money willingly. It was still abuse. "You are 65 years old, Marty," she said. "You are a widow living alone. Your children are stripping away your ability to care for yourself in your final years. If you need a nursing home in 10 years, where will the money come from? Do you think Jessica will pay for it?" The answer was a silent, painful no. Abigail gave me 3 instructions. First, we would change my will. Second, I was to document every single interaction with my children from that moment forward. Third, and most difficult, I was to stop the automatic transfers immediately. I drove home in a daze. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my banking app. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I found the recurring payments. I hovered my finger over the screen. I thought about Thomas. I thought about the life we built. I thought about the man Stephen used to be before he married Jessica. And then I thought about my cold cup of coffee on my birthday. I clicked cancel. I cancelled Stephen's $1,500. I cancelled Sarah's $800. I put the phone face down on the table. The silence of the house did not feel scary anymore. It felt like a clean slate. I knew they would call. I knew the storm was coming. But for the first time in 4 years, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The storm arrived exactly 48 hours later. Stephen and Sarah arrived at the house at the same time. I watched from the window as their cars pulled into the driveway. They did not look like children coming to visit their mother. They looked like business partners coming to settle a debt. Jessica was with them. She was the first one through the door. She wore a perfectly tailored coat and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Martha, dear," she said, as she walked into my living room. "We were so worried when we saw the transfers did not go through. We thought perhaps there was a technical error or, heaven forbid, that you were becoming confused about your accounts." She used a soft, condescending tone. It was the tone people use when they speak to someone they think is losing their mind. I did not offer them coffee. I did not offer them seats. I stood by the fireplace and looked at my children. "It was not a technical error," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how strong I felt. "I have decided to stop the monthly payments." The room went deathly quiet. Sarah was the first to break it. Her voice was high and frantic. "But Mom, Michael is counting on that money for the mortgage. We have Emily to think about. This feels like you are punishing us because of your birthday." Jessica stepped forward. She placed a hand on Stephen's arm, but her eyes were locked on mine. "Martha," she said, her voice dripping with artificial concern, "we understand that you are feeling lonely since Thomas passed. Grief can do strange things to the mind. It can make us paranoid. It can make us lash out at the people who love us most. We just want to help you stay grounded." There it was. The gaslighting. She was trying to tell me that my decision to keep my own money was a symptom of a mental breakdown. She was trying to make me doubt my own reality. I picked up the notebook I had prepared. "Stephen," I said, looking directly at my son, "in the last year, you have called me 22 times. 19 of those calls were to ask for money. Sarah, you called me 31 times. 26 of those were for money or for free childcare, so you and Michael could go away for the weekend." I saw Stephen flinch. He looked down at his shoes. "I have given the two of you $195,000 in 4 years, I continued. "I have worked night shifts at a care agency to make sure your lives were comfortable. I have sacrificed my own rest so Jessica could have new tires and Sarah could have a new furnace." Jessica laughed. A sharp, cold sound. "That is an incredibly unfair way to look at it," she said. "Stephen has supported you emotionally through everything." "Has he?" I asked. I looked at Sarah. "Sarah, last fall I had a medical procedure. I had a biopsy on a tumor that we were worried might be malignant. I spent 2 weeks waiting for the results, terrified that I was going to follow your father. I told you about it over the phone." I saw Sarah's face go pale. She looked toward the window. "I asked you to tell Stephen," I said. I did not want to worry him, but I wanted him to know. "Stephen, did you know your mother was sitting in a doctor's office alone waiting to find out if she had cancer?" Stephen looked at me. His eyes were wide. "What? Mom, what are you talking about?" "Sarah told me she would tell you," I said. Stephen turned to his sister. "Sarah? Why didn't you say anything?" Sarah's voice was a whisper. Things were so busy with Michael's work and Emily's soccer. I must have forgotten. My daughter had forgotten that her mother might be dying. But she had not forgotten to check if the $800 had hit her bank account on the 1st of the month. The silence that followed was heavy. For a moment the masks slipped. I saw the truth on their faces. They were not my protectors. They were my consumers. Jessica saw that she was losing control of the situation. She grabbed her handbag. "If you are going to be irrational and emotional, Martha, Then there is no point in talking, she said. We will give you some time to find your balance. Stephen, we are leaving. Stephen did not move. He was looking at me, really looking at me, for the first time in years. I saw the boy I had raised, buried under the man he had become. I had the biopsy, Stephen, I said softly. It was benign. Thank God. But I realized something during those 2 weeks of waiting. I realized that if I died tomorrow, the only thing you would miss is the money. Stephen's face changed. He looked like he had been struck. Mom, he started to say, but Jessica was already at the door. We are leaving, Stephen, she barked. He hesitated. He looked at me, then at his wife. The habit of obedience was strong. He followed her out the door. Sarah and Michael followed behind them, not saying a word. I stood in my living room as their cars sped away. I was shaking. My heart was racing. But I did not cry. I walked over to the mantel and looked at the photo of Thomas. I thought about what he had said. Martha, you are the strong one. I finally understood what he meant. Strength was not about carrying everyone else on my back. Strength was about standing up and refusing to be walked on. The battle was not over. I knew that. But as I turned off the lights and went upstairs to bed, I knew that the woman who lived on Maple Street was no longer invisible. If there is a pain worse than losing a husband, it is the pain of being discarded by your own children. I thought I had reached the bottom of my grief when Thomas died. I thought the silence of the house was my greatest enemy. But I was wrong. The true darkness arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April. A man I did not know walked up my porch steps. He was wearing a cheap suit and carrying a manila envelope. When I opened the door, he did not smile. He simply asked if I was Martha Sullivan. When I said yes, he handed me the envelope and said, "You have been served." I stood on my porch, watching him walk back to his car, while the cold Maine rain began to fall. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely tear open the paper. It was a petition to the probate court. I read the words, but my brain refused to understand them at first. The petitioner, the person suing me, was my daughter, Sarah. She was requesting that the court appoint a financial conservator to take total control of my assets. The grounds for the request were listed in cold, clinical language. They claimed I was showing signs of cognitive decline. They claimed I was at risk of financial self-harm. Cognitive decline. Self-harm. They were using my own love against me. Because I had stopped the monthly payments. Because I had finally said no. They were trying to convince a judge that I was no longer sane. I looked at the supporting documents. There was a letter from a physician named Dr. Richard Evans. He wrote that, based on family reports, I was suffering from early-onset dementia and was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. I had never met this man. I later found out he was Michael's uncle. But the part that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces was the statement from Jessica. She described me as increasingly paranoid and emotionally erratic since Thomas died. She claimed I was hearing voices. She claimed I was forgetting to pay my bills. I sat in the dark for a long time. I thought about the hours I spent in labor with Sarah. I thought about the nights I stayed awake when she had the flu. I thought about how I had worked double shifts to pay for her college. And this was the thanks I received. They did not want my health. They wanted my checkbook. They were treating me like a piece of old furniture that was in the way of their inheritance. Abigail Henderson, my attorney, told me I had to be strong. She said we had to fight this with everything we had. But first, I had to undergo a neuropsychological evaluation. I had to go to a clinic in Portland and sit in a small, windowless room for 6 hours. A doctor half my age asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. 93. 86. 79. She asked me to recall a sequence of unrelated words. She asked me to draw the face of a clock set to 10 minutes past 11. It was the most humiliating experience of my life. Every time I paused to think, I saw her making a note on her clipboard. I felt like a bug under a microscope. I wanted to scream that I was a retired nurse. I had saved lives. I had managed complex medications for 40 years. And here I was, proving that I knew what time it was. The doctor asked me why I had made the financial decisions I had. I looked her in the eyes, and I told her the truth. I told her I had made those decisions out of grief and a desperate fear of being alone. I told her I was finally waking up. She did not smile, but she listened. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of tears and anger. Stephen did not call me. I found out later that Jessica had convinced him that I was truly sick, that this was for my own protection. It is a terrible thing when a son believes a stranger over his own mother. I felt like a ghost in my own life. I walked through the rooms of my house and touched the walls. I wondered if they would sell the house. I wondered if they would put me in a state facility. The betrayal was complete. They were not just taking my money, they were trying to take my identity. They were trying to take my soul. The courthouse was a grey, imposing building that smelled of old floor wax and heavy silence. I sat at the wooden table next to Abigail Henderson. My back was straight, and I wore the navy blue suit I had bought for Sarah's graduation. I wanted to look like the woman I was. Capable, sane, and dignified. Across the aisle sat Sarah and Michael. They would not look at me. Sarah kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the part of the grieving daughter. Jessica was not there. She had sent her lawyer, a young man who looked like he had never spent a day in the real world. Judge Evelyn Harper took her seat. She was a woman in her late 50s with eyes that could see through any lie. She began by reading the report from the independent doctor who had evaluated me. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Judge Harper looked up and fixed her gaze on Sarah's attorney. She said, "This petition claims that Mrs. Sullivan is suffering from cognitive decline. However, the comprehensive evaluation shows that her memory and reasoning are above average for her age." My heart leaped in my chest. The judge continued. She pointed out that the letter from Dr. Richard Evans was completely biased. She asked why a doctor would sign a statement about a woman he had never even examined. Then she turned her attention to Sarah. "Mrs. Miller," the judge said, her voice like cold steel. "You claim your mother is incompetent because she stopped your monthly allowance. Is that correct?" Sarah started to sob. "We were just worried, Your Honor. My mother has been so different since my father died." The judge did not look impressed. She leaned forward. "Were you worried about your mother? Or were you worried about your mortgage? You filed this petition 3 weeks after your mother stopped the transfers. That is not an act of care. That is an act of greed. The petition was denied. I was free. I was legally, officially sane. But the victory felt hollow because my daughter was still sitting across from me, crying because she had failed to rob her own mother. As we walked out of the courtroom, a woman approached us. It was Kate, a woman who worked in the same office as Stephen. She looked nervous, but she handed me a thick envelope. She said, "Mrs. Sullivan, I could not sit by and watch this happen. I think you need to see what Jessica has been hiding." Abigail and I went back to her office and opened the envelope. Inside were screenshots of bank statements and credit card portals. The truth was darker than I ever imagined. Jessica had accumulated $68,000 in secret debt. Luxury retailers, designer handbags, expensive jewelry. She had been using the money I sent Stephen to pay the minimum balances on a dozen different credit cards. Stephen had no idea. He thought they were struggling because of the economy. He thought they were in a tough spot. But there was more. There was a series of emails between Jessica and Sarah. In those emails, Jessica had laid out the plan for the conservatorship. She told Sarah that if they could get control of my estate, they could split the life insurance money immediately. She told Sarah that Michael's unemployment did not have to be a problem anymore if they just managed me correctly. Michael had been unemployed for 8 months. They had lied to me about everything. Every emergency. Every furnace repair. Every cash flow issue. It was all a calculated performance to drain my bank account. I called Stephen. I told him to come to my house alone. When he arrived, he looked like a broken man. He had heard about the court's decision. and I think he was starting to feel the weight of what he had done. I sat him down at the kitchen table, and I laid the documents in front of him. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just watched him read. I watched his face go from confusion to horror. I watched him realize that his wife had been stealing from his mother and lying to his face for years. I watched him see the emails where Jessica talked about me like I was a bank vault to be cracked open. "Mom," he whispered, "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know about the debt. I didn't know Michael was out of work." I looked at my son. I said, "You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You let her lead you because it was easier than being a man. You let her sue your own mother, Stephen." Stephen broke down. He put his head in his hands, and he sobbed. He told me that Jessica had moved out that morning. They were separating. He said he couldn't look at her anymore without seeing the monster she had become. But I did not comfort him. I could not. The light of justice had finally shone into the dark corners of my family. But what it revealed was a ruin. My daughter had betrayed me in a court of law. My son had been a coward. My daughter-in-law was a thief. I told Stephen to leave. I told him I needed time to decide if there was anything left of our relationship to save. That night, I sat on my porch and looked at the stars. The air smelled of salt water and spring flowers. I was 65 years old. I had my money. I had my house. I had my sanity. But for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely alone. And strangely, it did not feel as scary as it used to. It took 2 months after the court hearing for the dust to finally settle. The air in Maine had turned warm. The lilacs were in full bloom in my backyard. For the first time in 4 years, the silence of the house did not feel like a burden. It felt like a sanctuary. I was no longer waiting for the phone to ring with another emergency. I was no longer checking my bank account with a sense of dread. One Saturday morning in June, a car pulled into my driveway. It was Sarah. She did not have her husband, Michael, with her. She only had little Emily. I watched from the window as Sarah walked up the path. She looked thinner. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. She did not look like the confident woman who had stood across from me in a courtroom. She looked like a child who had lost her way. Emily ran through the door the moment I opened it. "Grammy Marty," she shouted. She hugged my knees and showed me a drawing she had made. It was a picture of 2 people standing in a garden with very tall flowers. "That is you and me," she explained. "You are the one with the flowers, because you always smell like roses." I kissed her forehead and sent her into the living room to find her old box of toys. Sarah stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she held a cold cup of coffee. She did not ask for money. She did not mention the court case. "Mom," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I do not know where to start." I sat down across from her. "You do not have to start anywhere, Sarah. You just have to be honest." And for the first time in years, she was. She told me that Michael had not just lost his job 8 months ago. He had been fired for negligence. They had been living on credit cards and lies ever since. She admitted that the petition for the conservatorship was Jessica's idea, but she had gone along with it because she was terrified of losing her house. "I was so ashamed," Sarah sobbed. "Every time I asked you for money, the lie got bigger. It was easier to pretend Michael was still working than to tell you we had failed." I looked at my daughter. I felt a flicker of the old pain, but it was replaced by a new, firm clarity. "I love you, Sarah," I said. "But listen to me carefully. I will be your mother. I will be your daughter's grandmother. I will host your family for Sunday dinner. I will listen to your troubles, but I am finished being your banker." I saw her flinch, but I did not stop. "I will not be resuming the monthly transfers," I continued. "I will not be paying for Michael's mistakes or your pride. From this day forward, our relationship will be based on love and conversation, or it will not exist at all. The Bank of Martha Sullivan is closed. Permanently." Sarah nodded. Her eyes were wet. but for the first time she did not look like she was performing. "I understand," she said. "I actually think I wanted you to say that a long time ago. I just did not know how to stop the cycle." The next week, I went to see Abigail Henderson. We sat in her office and we did the work of protecting the future. I changed my will. I made sure that the bulk of what remained of my estate was placed into a protected trust for Emily. She would be able to access it for her education, and the rest would be hers when she turned 25. I wanted to make sure that her parents could not touch a single penny of it. I also established a nursing scholarship at the local hospital. We called it the Thomas Sullivan Memorial Scholarship for Nursing Excellence. It felt right. Thomas had always been so proud of my career. Now, his legacy would help other young women and men find their way into a profession of service. As for Stephen and Sarah, they remained in the will, but only for the legal minimum. I wanted them to know that an inheritance is a gift of respect, not a birthright of greed. Signing those papers was the lightest I had felt in years. It was as if I had finally put down a heavy suitcase I had been carrying since Thomas's funeral. But the real rebuilding happened inside of me. I started small. I went to the local community centre and signed up for a watercolour class. I had not picked up a paintbrush since I was in my early 20s. At first, my hands were stiff, my colours were muddy, but I kept going. I discovered that I loved the way the blue paint bled into the water, resembling the Maine coastline. I also joined a grief support group at the hospital. I thought I was going there to be helped, but I found out that I had a lot to offer. I was the veteran in the room. I could sit with a new widow and tell her, "Yes, the silence is loud. Yes, the first year is a mountain, but you are still here. You are not invisible." I even called my old college roommate, Patricia. She lived in Vermont and had been trying to reach me for 2 years. I had ignored her calls because I was too busy working night shifts to send money to Stephen and Jessica. "Martha!" she screamed when she heard my voice. "I thought you had moved to the moon." We talked for 3 hours. We laughed until we cried. We made plans for me to drive up to Vermont in October to see the leaves change. The ruins of my old life were still there, but I was building something new on top of them. I was no longer the woman who lived only for the needs of others. I was Martha. I was a painter. I was a friend. I was a woman who knew her own worth. One evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of lemonade. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over Maple Street. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Stephen. He was living in a small apartment now, and the divorce from Jessica was moving forward. The text said, "Mom, I went for a hike today. I saw a bird that looked like the ones Dad used to point out. I just wanted to say I am thinking of you. No rush to call back. Love, Stephen." I smiled. There was no mention of money, no mention of a crisis, just a son and his mother. I put the phone down and looked at the garden. The flowers were tall and strong, just like me. I was 65 years old, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was. My 66th birthday arrived on a quiet Thursday in March. It was so different from the year before. There was no cold coffee. There was no sitting alone at a silent table. This year, the house was filled with the smell of roasting prime rib and the sound of voices that actually wanted to be here. I hosted a dinner, a real dinner. Patricia and her daughter drove down from Vermont. They brought a sense of history and old friendship that made the room feel warm. Abigail, my dear attorney, came as a guest this time. She brought a good bottle of wine and a smile that told me she was proud of the woman I had become. Stephen came alone. His marriage to Jessica was over, and while he was still healing, he seemed lighter. He arrived early and helped me set the table. He did not ask for money. He did not look at his phone. We just talked about his life and the hiking trips he was planning. Sarah and Michael brought little Emily. Michael was quiet, but he was genuinely pleasant. He had a new job now, and the desperation that had driven him to lie was gone. Sarah helped me in the kitchen, and for the first time in years, we did not talk about bills. We talked about the garden. Emily wore a bright green dress with yellow flowers. She told 4 different knock-knock jokes that made absolutely no sense. But we all laughed anyway. We laughed until our sides ached. At one point in the evening, I stepped away from the table. I walked over to the mantel and looked at the photograph of Thomas. I looked at the letter he had left me, the one I had moved from his desk to mine. Martha, you have always been the strong one. I finally understood what he meant. Strength was not about never feeling pain. It was not about carrying the weight of my children's mistakes until I broke. Strength was surviving the hurting and staying true to myself anyway. I looked back at the table. I saw my son and my old friend comparing notes about national parks. I saw my daughter laughing as Emily tried to feed a piece of bread to a stuffed bear. This was what Thomas meant when he said, "Love was about giving people a chance." I had stopped trying to buy their love. I had stopped trying to fix their lives with my bank account. And in doing so, I had given them the chance to be the people I knew they could be. Before the night ended, I looked at the candlelight reflecting in the window. I felt a deep, quiet peace. I was 66 years old. I was a widow. I was a mother. I was a painter. But most of all, I was free. Thank you for listening to my journey. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us share more stories of strength and resilience with people who might need to hear them. And remember, you are never too old to set a new boundary or to start a new chapter. I am Martha Sullivan, and I am finally home.